Good evening, everybody, and welcome to WGBH Studios in the Yawkey Theater. We're glad you're joining us tonight. My name's Ted Canova. I'm the Managing Director of News for WGBH News. We're going to have a really great hour program tonight with people who have been on the ground in places that we only see on television. And they're going to really examine the depth and perspective of ISIS, of what's going on over there, and also the importance of what it means for journalists and also for the public who's trying to cover this under incredible situations and circumstances that are tragic, as we see in the news every month. It's presented, this program, by The World, the wonderful program that you hear on WGBH Radio twice a day at 3 in the afternoon and at 8 at night, hosted by Marco Werman. Executive producer is Andrew Sussman. Andrew. And Marco. And after the program, we're going to have a little reception, and you're going to be able to meet them and a bunch of other colleagues from the world that can give you insight on their jobs and also stories that you'd like to talk about. So it's going to be a great program in here and a great program out there after the show. You know, on one of the first days that Boston Public Radio expanded to 3 hours, a caller called into Jim and Marjorie and said, you know, the U.S. can't take care of the whole world. And it was kind of a profound view. It's an easy view for the public to think about. It's kind of a basic comment that you hear Marco go deeper in every weekday. But it's also something that is the backdrop to tonight's program. When we're looking at examining the threat of ISIS, a couple of things come to mind. Obviously, the perils that reporters face on the ground. I read in the Times maybe just a week ago that someone was kidnapped a half a mile from the border and was held hostage. So this isn't just reporters going deep into the territory, it's just across the border. One of our experts tonight is going to talk about whether ISIS is sustainable, whether Goliath may have holes in it that maybe we don't report as much. And also we're going to touch a bit on kidnapping, which has become really a major industry that's financing ISIS, and what the world, and specifically the United States and its position on paying for ransom, what impact that has on society, on voters, and on the rest of the world, especially when other countries are paying to free some of their captives. If you'd like to ask a question, there are two ways to do it. Hopefully when you walked in, there's an index card you were given, and you could fill it out, put on your name. You can hand it to one of the ushers that are raising their hands by the entryway here. Or you could do it in this real high-tech way with Twitter, which the hashtag is #RiseOfISIS. And feel free to use your smartphone when you're in here. We did a program a couple of weeks ago, and we were getting questions from overseas and the West Coast. So even though they may not be hearing this broadcast right now, they are following it on Twitter, and our social media team here is going to be tweeting out some of the quotes. So don't be surprised if people from the Middle East may even take part in this, which would be really interesting. Again, I mentioned after the formal program, there'll be a reception. You're invited to have a drink, meet our team, ask more questions of the panelists. And if you haven't had a tour of WGBH Studios, we'd be glad to take you around for a few minutes on that also. Before we begin, I want to extend a real special welcome and a thank you to the WGBH Lowell Society, and also the Sustained Giving members this evening. These are folks who just don't donate to WGBH, but they are very generous in their donations, and they are scattered around here in our seats, and they make programs like this very possible, and they actually help fuel the journalism that's going on in this building, so we thank you for that. There are 3 partners that are from WGBH that are on this panel tonight, and it is incredibly heavy in terms of their experience, and we are so lucky in this building to have them under one roof or 2 roofs across the street. But it's The World, it's the GroundTruth project, and it's FRONTLINE. And to work in a building like this is not just a special feeling, but it really raises all of our games because we work with people like that and organizations like that and programs like that. So you're going to get a taste of that, what we see every day here at WGBH. Before we start, or really to kick off the evening, some of you may have seen the recent documentary that FRONTLINE did, The Rise of ISIS. We're going to play a clip of that to get this evening started. Thank you.
This ISIS story is just an incredible tale of our time, something that most of us have never seen before, and we hope that it will go away fairly quickly. How many people saw the movie? So that's good. We have a basis for the conversation today. We hope to talk about where ISIS came from, who they are, and what might happen next with this organization and with the Middle East. And we'll start with Martin Smith, who produced the rise of ISIS. And Martin, you've been reporting now for decades, about 40 years from some of the world's hotspots. You've met some really unpleasant people. Let's start with you. Where did ISIS come from, and what's going on?
Yeah. So, well, this project began when David Fanning, the senior executive producer of FRONTLINE, called me up after ISIS had taken Mosul and said, what are we going to do about ISIS? And I said, do you mean what's the United States going to do, or what is FRONTLINE going to do? The idea behind it was to take a step back and try to get our heads around what the origins were. And the news was covering the atrocities, the news was covering the sort of the fall of Mosul, all the surprise. 4 months ago, very few of us in this room, I think, had ever heard of ISIS 4 or 5 months ago. And what I quickly found out is there was a very rich political story in the frustration of the Sunni community that was quashed by the increasing sectarian policies of Maliki that softened places like Mosul, Fallujah, and Ramadi to ISIS being able to really pushing on an open door when they came into these cities, because the population was, they didn't like ISIS particularly, but they really hated Maliki more.
Maliki, the leader of Iraq, the Shia leader of Iraq.
The prime minister of the Shia-led government. So I hadn't seen this really covered. I had been in Iraq last in 2007, and the story of the tens of thousands of Sunnis taking to the streets, pressing for Maliki to keep the promises that he had made before the Americans left the country. Tens of thousands of people in several cities across. It was their Arab Spring. It wasn't covered here. People didn't really know much about it. But yet, when Maliki met those demonstrators with machine guns and massacred people, you had people willing to invite ISIS into their cities, or in fact, some young men actually taking up arms. Some people that had been participating in those peaceful protests taking up arms and being willing to join the fight. So that was the basic idea. And for me, I mean, Maliki had really prevented people from even going out with cameras and photographing those demonstrations. It was a revelation just to be able to see those pictures, which we were able to get cobbled together from various sources, including one very brave young man who lived in Ramadi and had documented a lot of that as it was going on. Ramadi is about 60 miles to the west of Baghdad.
Now, a lot of the problem that we're facing now is journalists can't get to Iraq. They couldn't get to Iraq for years, right? It's been very dangerous. Charlie and I have talked about this before, and I brought kind of a prop here. There was a time, Charlie, when
I remember that when you used to actually wear that press
there
pass
was
on
a time
the
where
chest.
you could wear this vest, and all you had to worry about, and this is not a joke, all you had to worry about was getting shot or blown up even, and these days that is not our only problem. You are the co-founder of Global Post. You work here at the GroundTruth project. Your job is to send people out into the field. You worked closely with James Foley. We all know the story there. What do we do? How do we tell this story?
One of the things about those vests is that there's a Velcro pad there where you can rip the press part off. I don't know if this one has it, but I remember the point after 2001 when the peril really began to become very real, particularly around Danny Pearl, who was killed in early 2002. And I remember many of us just that's the point at which you rip the Velcro press off your vest and you put that away. And all those vests we had that said press, we put away. I covered the war in Afghanistan from the ground, right from the beginning, was among the first reporters in. I covered the war in Iraq and was also among the first reporters in Iraq. I came in from the north. We got a little delayed, if you remember, in the north, but was on the ground for that war and lived in Jerusalem and did conflict in Israel-Palestine. There is a moment we're in right now of peril that is extraordinary for journalists in the field, and it is rising, and it's a moontide of peril. It is going to keep going up, I fear. When I started Global Post as founding editor in 2008, we went around the world to build a team, and we built a really great team. We launched in 2009. How many of you have been on Global Post or know of Global Post? Okay. So it used to be very few. We're getting better. But Global Post is an online international news organization. It's based here in Boston. And we started it because newspapers like the Boston Globe, where I worked for many years, began to close their foreign bureaus. So we started a new kind of news organization that would take this time when news organizations were shrinking their foreign coverage and try to really grow it.
And can you do the job now?
So what I was going to say is the business model that closed a lot of the foreign bureaus came about in a digital age with the web, has really threatened what we do. Commercially, I think great reporting on the ground is expensive, it's dangerous, and therefore you need the resources to do it right. It's a time of limited resources, and the truth is we have to realize that in that changing climate, if we're going to create new models of journalism, we are obligated as editors and we're obligated as producers to be sure we are doing it right and we're doing it carefully. Our correspondent at Global Post, Jim Foley, who was beheaded by ISIS, was a colleague and friend of some of our team here. He worked really closely with the Middle East editor at Global Post, Pete Gelling, who was a great editor for him. He had a very close relationship with everyone at Global Post, and he is a huge loss for Global Post, but for the whole journalistic community. How many of you have heard of the story of Jim Foley and know about his story? Jim Foley's death sobers us in this moment to say, we live in a time when we have to have great journalism from the field if we're going to understand the story. Marty went there and did that, and we need it. But if we do it, we're going to have to pay a lot more attention to safety for correspondents. So GroundTruth is the new nonprofit arm of Global Post, or companion to Global Post. And our mission is to train and mentor the next generation of correspondents to do this kind of work in the field, but to do it safely. And that's really got to be a nonprofit mission. It's got to be mission-driven, and we have to think about it outside the commercial model of online advertising supporting journalism, because that model is not going to work to do the level of work that Marty and the Frontline team do, or that many others do. We're going to have to also have an arm that's going to rely on foundation and individual support if we're going to do it safely. So the peril is rising, the model is changing, and we hope the GroundTruth project can be part of a conversation that's happening nationally and globally with Committee to Protect Journalists, Reporters Without Borders, and other organizations who are aware of this and who are trying to come up with new protocols, new standards, and a real commitment to a culture of safety.
Well, one of the problem, as you say, is the game has changed, right? Even Saddam Hussein, if you got into Iraq, chances are you wouldn't be beheaded. I mean, all the crazy dictators around the world, if you get in, chances are, for the most part, you're okay. The question is, for Mia, who are these people? What is it that drives people to join an organization like this, that behaves like this? You've written a book, Bombshell, also Dying to Kill, which talk about what motivates people, what motivates women to join these groups. You're a professor of terrorism studies of security studies at UMASS Lowell. What is with these people?
Well, I think you've got a fairly diverse group. I think the Frontline piece did a fantastic job of explaining what are the internal to Iraq motivations that led to this in the first place, showing how, with the Arab tribes cooperating with the government, cooperating with the United States during the awakening, they were pretty much able to bring AQI, which is Al-Qaeda in Iraq, to a very, very small core group and weaken them internally because they neither had the support of the Shia, they didn't even have support of the Sunni tribes. What you have, I think, as a result of 2 years of extremely sectarian, violent politics that excluded the Sunnis to the degree that even members of the government were being targeted. Their bodyguards were being kidnapped and killed. They themselves were being arrested or threatened. Now what you have is a spillover effect. You don't just have Iraqis and people like Baghdadi or people who were formerly at Gitmo. What you have now is you have an attraction and a lure that is going throughout the world to the extent that when you look at the foreign fighters, almost every country in the world, except maybe Antarctica, is contributing to foreign fighters. We've focused a lot on the foreign fighters coming from the West. The overwhelming number, however, have come from Arab countries. And what's interesting is that the New York Times ran a piece, I guess about 10 days ago, that talked about Tunisia, which has been the greatest success of the Arab Spring countries in terms of its levels of democracy and freedom, has contributed the most foreign fighters
right.
to ISIS.
So what are they looking for? Is it a religious quest? Is it a jihad as it's made out to be? Are they just out for some sort of glory?
So one of the things that's been especially attractive is ideationally at some higher level, the fact that the caliphate was established and Muslims around the world see, hear the word caliphate and think, okay, well, I have either an individual or a general obligation to go to the caliphate. And so there is something that they can get from being in a caliphate that they cannot get
The caliphate being a pure Muslim
the
state.
idea of being ruled over by a Muslim ruler, and many of the people, when they talk about why they joined, they'll say things like they didn't feel that they could be Muslims in the West, or they felt oppressed, or they felt persecuted, or they felt, that they were being treated poorly. At the same time, you also have a huge swath of people who, for them, to quote the director of my center, John Horgan, it's the Call of Duty war. They are participating in the kind of, gaming that they've grown up on.
It's a live video game,
It's a live video game in real time, real action. And even though, and I would say this to be the case, the majority of the foreign fighters are not the battle-hardened people that were in the frontline piece. Majority are these, teenage or early 20s, people who themselves don't really feel that they are making a real contribution, or they're not going to change history. They're tired of being not the agents of change in history. They are just bystanders. This allows them to participate in a way that at some level psychologically is empowering, even though what they're doing is, like André Poulain, the Canadian who went out to ISIS, probably within just a few weeks, they're going to be cannon fodder. And like the women who think that they're going to have this very exciting and adventurous experience, they're going to get out there, and within a few weeks, they're going to be married and pregnant, and basically, that's not the life that they're anticipating in terms of their contribution to the cause.
Was that you who pointed out that they're being offered refrigerators and cookers and all sorts of
My favorite was that
booty.
they're being offered milkshake machines. And my response was, how much ice cream is in Raqqa that they have milkshake machines? And this is what Laith, which is this Glaswegian girl, Aqsa Mahmoud, put on her Tumblr account as a way to convince women in the West so that they're using the Western women to recruit other Western women. And for me, being in a school of criminology, it looks very similar to the way online predators recruit children. They are using a mixture of tricks and treats, and in fact, I'm working on research with someone here in the audience, Ian Elliott, to show the commonalities between the predators and these people who are attracting these teenage girls in much the same way.
Now, this is not something I should probably say out loud in front of a group of people, but when you see the videos, much of what we see, right, has been shot by ISIS themselves, because they want you to know that it is sort of, you know, jihad porn, I think somebody called it. And it looks pretty cool. If you're a 19-year-old kid with, as you say, nothing to do.
I was going to say that the Arab Spring was about young people wanting to change the world, change their countries, change their lives. They were looking at these sclerotic regimes who presided over them with tyranny and dictatorships, some like Egypt that we supported for a very long time. And I think the Tahrir Square moment, which Marty and I worked together on 2 films for Frontline about Egypt, and you could feel the streets really wanting to affect change. You could feel young people coming together with social networking. Remember the Facebook revolution? And there was this real passionate sense of we're going to change the world. It's exciting. Tahrir Square was equal in terms of its draw for people to come out. And I think we saw it ripple through the region, and it almost affected change. One thing to reflect on, despite the intense complexity of the Tunisia piece of this, is what happens when America doesn't seize that moment and really foster that yearning for democracy. Instead, on 4th of July weekend, a military coup happened in Egypt, and America didn't have a lot to say about it because it was the Muslim Brotherhood that was being overthrown, even if they were democratically elected by 2/3 majority. We just thought it wasn't really something we need to worry about because let's get rid of that Muslim Brotherhood. But something Marty and I learned in reporting this out is that al-Zawahiri, Egyptian, now the head of al-Qaeda, has for decades criticized the Muslim Brotherhood for believing in democracy because he said the second you get elected, the West will never let you rule. So one thing to reflect on in American foreign policy is, to what extent have we allowed Zawahiri to make his case? If you don't embrace the yearnings for democracy, even if we don't like where they're going in the short term, and the Muslim Brotherhood was not going in a good direction. Their constitution was against minorities, against women, deep concerns. But as we were talking about in the green room, why the rush? Let democracy take its course and unseat them in an election.
Well, the original thought was that the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood had proven Zawahiri wrong.
Right.
That
So
Islamists can get themselves elected, can govern.
ISIS takes the energy from that, I think. And as you point out, it
From the
uses
failure
that
of
fuel.
that.
Yes.
I wanted to go back to Mia's point about these fighters that are coming. I think we have trouble getting our heads around the sort of ultra-violence and wondering how it is that they are attracted. And it's not quite enough to posit that it's a sort of a video game attraction, because there's a big difference between a video game and reality. But the truth is that until this fight for the town of Kobani on the Turkish border, on the Syrian-Turkish border, there really hasn't been a battle. And I think the word has gone out to many of these people that they can come join this thing. The Iraqi army is, frightened, rotten to the core, on the run. We can go out there and we can have a damn good time. And you look at a lot of their videos, and I've looked at more than I want to admit in making the film. There's a lot of posing for pictures. There's a lot of joking
Ray-Ban
around.
sunglasses.
And I watched one video, for instance. Yeah, I mean, these guys are having a good time.
Yeah, they are.
They're now, in fact, the story out today was they're taking cruise ships because the airplanes are watching out for them. So they're taking cruise ships from Morocco over to Turkey so they can get out and go down and cross the border and fight. But there just hasn't been that much fighting. The real fighting is taking place by these really hardcore guys that were out in the desert and were the guys that we didn't kill.
Or the ex-Baathists that were trained by Saddam.
Right,
Or
and
the
again,
ex-Baathists.
Who they met in American prisons.
Right, the American prisons were the incubators for a lot of this coming together of Ba'athist military experience with the fervency of Islamic jihad.
Okay,
But I
we're
wanted
gonna-
to mention there's just one video that I saw, and it looked like going to the gym. I mean, these guys were working out, getting pumped, and then they slaughtered a goat, and everybody had a full plate of food. And if you're coming from some of these places in a dead-end life, that looked pretty damn attractive.
We're going to take a look at another video from the Frontline documentary. Just want to let you know we will take your questions in the next part of this after the video. Send up cards. I've got your questions here on the tablet, and we'll ask some of those. So get your cards in, and we'll watch this. So the question is, will the Islamic State endure? tens of thousands of people flocking to Iraq and Syria? Is this a movement we're going to be dealing with for years to come? Our next president will be dealing with after the election, Charlie?
I wanted to say the berm that they're breaking over there, it is very much alive in the minds of ISIS, the relevant moment of history. So at the GroundTruth Project, we've been doing a series on the 100th anniversary of World War I. When he says we don't pay any attention to these lines, he's referring to the lines of World War I maps that were drawn after the war that created the modern Middle East, that created Iraq. They've never been recognized by much of the Islamic militant parts of the Muslim world. And that expression of that is more than just history and the Sykes-Picot Agreement, for those of you who know your history. It's really an expression that I think enlivens the imagination of the militants, that it's a whole new world, it's a whole new map, and I think we're going to see it for a very long time playing out, particularly in small-scale little combat. The experience I just had in Iraq, going to see Tracy Shelton, who's a Global Post award-winning, great correspondent. I went over and worked with her for this project on World War I, and we saw, right on these lines, a little tiny skirmish that was just a small battle in a war that's going to go on for a long time. There's going to be hit and run, cat and mouse fighting, and I fear it'll go on for years and years. And I don't think airstrikes will put a dent in it. And I think what we're in for is a kind of grind, I fear. And what I'm hearing from military analysts and from people who really know the battlefield geometry, the long war just got a lot longer.
Over years and years and years, decades? What are we looking at?
Well, I think that when you say, will the Islamic State endure, you have to ask yourself, what is the Islamic State? The Islamic State as an idea has been around for a while and will continue. And yes, they can be degraded by airstrikes, but they cannot be rooted out. And even if you are able to defeat them militarily with a reliable force on the ground, which we are years away from accomplishing, the Iraqi forces, the Syrian rebels that we're training up, these are not forces that are going to, anytime soon, eradicate the Islamic State. But even once you do that, and as one interviewee told me, I mean, the easy part of this is the military victory. The difficult part of this are the problems of sectarian hatreds that are deeply rooted in the region, the false borders. I mean, Iraq, as we've known it, is a fiction as a state that can work. So I think the idea of an Islamic State, as Charlie just pointed out, has great attraction. The caliphate has great attraction to people. That idea will live, and these problems are, go way beyond a military defeat of ISIS.
That fiction of what is known as Iraq, and only been known as that for 100 years, is that you can throw together Sunni, Shia, and Kurdish populations under one rule. That's the British Empire that decided that was more convenient, particularly to keep the oil fields of Mosul in 1916, right when those oil fields are beginning to be discovered, and they're recognizing they need this to sustain their naval fleet. That convenience of Western imperialism is really unraveling. I mean, we're witnessing a 100-year mark of history right now. The modern Middle East is coming undone before our eyes. Okay, it might sound like an overly dramatic statement, but certainly in Iraq it's not. I think a Kurdish state's an inevitability, and I think the Sunni and Shia divide, which we've been looking at the GroundTruth Project for 2 years now, is playing out in a proxy war in Syria. I fear it's going to be a real regional conflagration along those lines, or it is already one.
So I'm going to play devil's advocate for a second and say that, yes, Iraq was a fiction. It was a creation of 3 different sanjak of the Ottoman Empire, and it was a marriage of convenience. Of all the states in the Middle East that lack legitimacy, at least Iraq had a pre-Islamic identity. It had an Islamic identity. Jordan would be far more in danger than Iraq. And I think a lot of what we have to understand is that these countries have gone to great lengths to create the state in the minds of the 3 or 4 generations, through sports, through teaching them at a very young age, through propaganda. So I don't know. I mean, I think Iraq as it is now, yes, it's very weak. And in fact, I think Les
So,
Gelb
Mia, are you
called this.
suggesting that Iraq can stay? Can
No,
Iraq
I think
remain
that-
a country?
No, I think that, Les Gelb made this prediction in 2004 that maybe what we should do is help Iraq separate rather than force it to stay together. But whether or not the Islamic State can endure, I think for me is where I take a slightly different perspective, where I'm looking at it and I'm seeing very diverse places like Saudi Arabia, Al-Azhar, the Council of British Muslims in the UK, all of the standard Sunni mainstream Islamic sources of theology have basically said, ISIS is not Islam. These people are Khawarij. They are violating the tenets of Islam. They're posers. And in fact, in many of these environments, Muslims have been told, if you join ISIS, you're excommunicated. You will not be a Muslim anymore. So I don't know if that's a model that's actually tenable over the long term, that these foreign fighters are basically very much on the outs. It's not gaining in popularity, and at least according to the story in the New York Times today, militarily, ISIS is having problems in Iraq, not so much in Syria, but that the airstrikes, absolutely, you can't win a war with air alone. But we're not factoring in the role of Iran. At some point, if ISIS began to be really a threat to Iran, and you know what? That is one country you really don't want to mess with. That is a country that when they go to war, they stay at war for 8 years or for as long as it takes. But during that first Iraq war, the point I wanted to make is the Shia didn't leave and join Iraq. So the sectarian nature of Iraq has really flourished since this recent war, since post 9/11. But whatever you could say about Saddam Hussein, he had created the fiction of Iraq as a reality for that generation.
I thought it was the strength of Marty's.
Hang on, Charlie, just a moment. Mia, one of your students, Sean Walsh, asks, could the ex-Baathists have an influence on exactly what you're talking about? Could they jump ship from ISIS and be a stabilizing force?
Yeah, I mean, ISIS, as we know it, is a coalition. It's a coalition of tribesmen who threw in their lot with an anti-Maliki insurgency. It's the hardcore jihadis, and it's the Baathists. And it's a coalition that has already shown signs of fracturing. And, Baathists, there are different stripes of Baathists. Some of them have already become jihadis. Some of them are still sort of secular to the core. But yeah, I mean, this is a weak coalition. I think the key to it is the tribes. I think getting the tribes to come over, as was done during the Sunni awakening by General Petraeus and others, is the key. And if you can get the tribesmen to say, we don't want ISIS in our towns and communities, then I think that this whole ISIS thing falls apart.
And I don't think that the Baathists ideologically are that firmly entrenched. I think, as your film documented, they're really in it for their own power and their own position, and the fact that they are trying to recoup what they lost when they were, predominant. So like the town of Tikrit could literally turn on a dime.
It's a little bit more than that, isn't it? I mean, it's also that they feel so betrayed by the government in Baghdad that is so clearly a Shia-dominated government. And I thought it was the great strength of the film was to create that TikTok, that narrative, to watch the point at which the U.S. troops pull out, Maliki moves forward and begins to exercise a Shia domination that the Sunni population, particularly in Mosul, is repelling against, and therefore receiving even this death cult, ISIS, if it's going to be what will be an expression of their rage. So it's not the Baathists just looking to recoup sort of crass, linear power. I think it's something deeper about a feeling of insecurity on the part of the Sunni, which is why this thing is so volatile.
There's a question here from Joyce Maroney out here in the audience. She wonders, and this is a question that's asked a lot and discussed quite a bit on our program, since the Kurds are willing to fight and back the U.S., why don't we back them? Why don't they become our proxy in this fight?
They are, and we do. And what stuns me, I really was with the Kurds a lot in 2003 and before, in the 90s, and have covered that region for long enough to wonder, how is it that the Kurds still have faith in us We let them down time and time again. You remember there was the no-fly zone, but then they didn't rule out the helicopters. Where were we with the Anfal campaign when you saw Saddam Hussein, then sort of our ally, going after and just killing, you know, what is it, 120,000 people killed in the Anfal campaign, or more, I think it is. The barbarity that the Kurds have suffered with us watching and not really doing anything makes me wonder, how is it that they're loyal to us? But they are, because they see us as the best bet for their yearnings for democracy. It's a region full of bloodshed and tyranny and corruption and terrible things. But the one thing you do feel in the Kurdish population is a sense of commerce. They're really good at sort of rip-offs and trade, and you know, they're real hustlers. But they are mercantile, and they believe in democracy, and they're showing that. And they want an independent state. And our honor will be on the line if they fight ISIS as hard as they are right now, to back them in that. I agree completely with the question.
I mean, one of the things that the Kurds are going to have to overcome is the fact that there is this Talabani-Barzani split, that at various points in time, the different families either cooperated.
Yeah, they're done with that.
Talabani lost because he's so ill and frail. I think you could feel it on the ground in, I don't know if you felt this, but in Sulaymaniyah and in Erbil, you know.
So it's Barzani all the way.
Barzani won. That family feud has.
This is a decades-long
fight.
fight.
Yeah, it's Godfather
between the Kurds.
3 now.
Right.
We're out of Godfather.
They had their own civil war.
Yeah.
And the Godfather 3. We have a question from Bill right here in the front. ISIS seems to be an idea that is as powerful to some citizens of Iraq and Syria, maybe in much of the Middle East as we're talking about, as sort of the freedom ideal is to the United States. Can ISIS be degraded without these folks getting rid of this ideal? I don't know, Bill, is the ideal the caliphate, or when you say the caliphate ideal?
That's at the core of your film, Marty. You should take that
Well,
one.
I mean, I was saying before, I think the idea of having a state, a Sunni state, that spans the Syrian-Iraq, the old Syrian-Iraq border, is a very attractive idea to a lot of people there, as well as those coming from abroad. But it's not something. I mean, that can be defeated militarily, but the urge to somehow carve out some space, I think, is what will happen in the post-ISIS period, and that will be some kind of Sunni zone. I mean, the Sunnis are not going to settle for less than what the Kurds have already achieved in the autonomy that they have. So I think this is what we're talking about here, is the split up of the country. Now, what happens on the Syrian side of the border is a more complicated thing. I don't know how, you know, I mean, that is pretty lawless territory, and until Assad is gone or some settlement is reached, I don't know.
The complexity of the alliances that are shifting and forming right now are pretty extraordinary. If you think about the US and Iran fighting together against the Islamic State, yet once the Islamic State is degraded, I'm not so sure the president's wish to have them destroyed is going to happen, but degrading is one thing. If you then get through that, let's say you even did that successfully, which I think will take a long time and won't happen without more troops on the ground, because they say we won't put troops on the ground. There already are troops on the ground. If the question is, will more be on the ground? But even when you finish that, you then have Bashar al-Assad in power, and you have the war still raging, and then we suddenly are against Iran, because Iran is going to back the Alawite Bashar al-Assad.
You know, guys,
US
this
is going to be
really
against
complicated.
it. I know, it's,
We
is.
don't do complicated here.
Okay.
While we've been speaking, this came from the Associated Press. President Obama has written a rare letter to Iran's Ayatollah. We heard about that today, but included in that letter is a discussion about the fight against ISIS. So it is not exactly what you're talking about now is not so far-fetched.
Right.
That the U.S. and Iran joined together.
Well, they are. They're
Well, they
just
are
not
together.
talking directly about the fact that they're joining together. But on the battlefield, they're going in the same direction. So it's a stunning time of all these axioms you've heard about in the Middle East, of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. I think it's becoming even more complicated. What happens when the enemy of your enemy is your enemy? And what happens when, you know, you don't have any friends? And I think the equation has just gotten infinitely more complex.
Well, okay, now talking about enemies and friends, we have a question from the audience. This one comes from Sid, and Barbara has a similar question. What is the role of Saudi Arabia, some of the other neighbors in the region? Someone mentioned earlier that this is a proxy fight, right, between
I
the
think
whole...
I was about to jump in and say that
Okay.
before you asked the question, that one simpler way to think about this is a proxy war between the Sunni states of the Middle East and Iran, and the portion of Iraq that is Shia. So you have a proxy based in Saudi Arabia, centered in Saudi Arabia, fighting using, there's no government support, as Mia pointed out, for ISIS, but there are deep-pocketed sheikhs throughout Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the United Arab Emirates.
And they were arming the opposition. They just didn't realize it was a black box in which there was this thing called ISIS taking shape.
And some were, in fact, I'm sure. Money went to bin Laden before, so there was money going to ISIS. They quickly became a self-sustaining force. But you have them using ISIS as a proxy, and you have the Shia militia being supported by Iran fighting on the other side. Mm-hmm. So it's a simpler way to think of it, perhaps. It does get complicated. The fact that it gets complicated is why we've never been successful in all our forays. I think we're about 0 and 20 in the region.
The other country to think about is Turkey. Saudi Arabia, we know, I think you've explained that well, but Turkey, I think a question many of you might have, I know I've had, is like, what are they doing? They're sort of sitting this one out as they watch two of their enemies kill each other. So on that front, they're kind of good where they are. They're
worried about the third enemy getting independence. So
right,
there's
the
three
Kurds,
enemies.
right? So the only military action they've taken is to hit Kurds inside southeast Turkey.
It's exactly what we did when the Iranians were killing the Iraqis for 8 to 10 years, and we sat by and were happy that was going on.
But I think Turkey has an obligation, and I don't think the United States has ever, in this administration in particular, wielded its authority very well in terms of what's expected of allies. What was Turkey doing leaving that border so wide open for people to be flowing through there?
Well, because they were the good guys at one point, weren't they?
But
the bad guys were the good guys, the enemies were the friends, and the
Turkey's very sophisticated about its borders, and I do think there was a point over the spring, summer, where it was pretty clear there was a lot of bad guys flowing in, and they didn't shut it down. Question is why. Turkey is a country that's going to be, I think, very, very much one to watch in terms of understanding the regional powers and the influences here.
Some things have changed over time. I think that initially you're right, between Qatar and Saudi Arabia, there was a lot of money flowing to this amorphous anti-Assad coalition. But I know that the Saudis have put $100 million to fight ISIS. Turkey did shut down the power grid so that there was no power going to ISIS, and in fact, they turned around and started threatening Turkey. So I think part of the explanation for why Turkey is sitting on the border with Kobane and just, not getting involved, acting all Swiss, is that they have been routinely threatened by ISIS, and there is a concern, and this is something you see commonly, where, perhaps if we let the terrorists through, they won't attack us. So there is a bit of that going on in Turkey, but I think Turkey itself is also facing a real challenge, because on the one hand, in the coalition, you have elements of the Islamic parties, but they don't want to put in, their vote with ISIS. They're not aligning with ISIS, but at the same time, they don't want to look like they're supporting Bashar al-Assad. It's a very tough situation.
Yeah. Turkey's not as noble as the Swiss, I would say. I think of them more...
And their chocolate is nowhere near as good either.
But I would think of them more as my days covering police in New York City, when one drug gang would be killing the other drug gang, and the police would do nothing about the rival war, because as one detective once told me with that great sort of shrug of a New York City cop, it's public service murder. And that, I think, is much more where Turkey's head is at.
We have this via a Twitter user from Russia using our hashtag Rise of ISIS. Do you think ISIS poses a threat to the other neighboring countries, Jordan, Lebanon. Specifically, refugees, what is the threat?
No, absolutely, and that's something that I was saying in the summer. I was interviewed in one of the Arab stations in Arabic, and I said that ISIS, given the fact that the majority of the foreign fighters were coming from Arab countries and Turkey, that they are a greater threat in terms of the returnees than they are to the United States. And so as a result, it really is incumbent upon those neighboring countries to provide the boots on the ground. And I think actually your film made that point, that it might be that the United States and some of the coalition forces are able to provide the air support, but it's really the locals that are in the surrounding countries that really have to populate any kind of army that would go in. Because at the end of the day, it needs to be shown that ISIS is a threat to the Arab world greater than it is a threat to the United States.
How the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan continues to survive mystifies me, because you have a 60 to maybe 70% majority Palestinian, and then you have refugee camps in the hundreds of thousands forming on the border. And one thing I've not seen reported, and it's maybe something we should get busy about, is how do we know that they don't have ISIS infiltrating the refugee camps to then spill into Jordan? Because the refugees are flowing in and out of the camps and in some of the communities where the camps are. And I guess most of all, driving through Jordan this summer, just a couple weeks ago, I'm losing track of time, driving through Jordan and recognizing that I have never felt more a sense of precarious calm. You know, looking at the number of riot police, Jordan was always the place where when you came back from Iraq, or you came back from the war in Lebanon, or you were wherever the worst things in the world were going on, you tended to come through Jordan and you let your shoulders down for a minute and you sort of breathe.
Some sushi.
Yeah, you could get sushi. You could actually go to a nice hotel. You could, kind of get calm a little bit. Driving through there, I did not feel that this time, and I sensed a lot more street presence of riot cops. I saw a little outbreak of a demonstration, college students demonstrating about something, but the batons were out. Muslim Brotherhood is ascendant in the parliament there. I'm very curious about reporting on Jordan. I just fear we miss everything. The State Department has missed everything. The fall of the wall. The Soviet Union, we missed that one. Then we missed the rise of Al-Qaeda. Then we miss the actual 9/11 event. Then we missed the Arab Spring. What's next? ISIS? Oh, okay, we missed ISIS.
4 months ago, they
Jordan.
were the B team, right?
Yeah, I mean, when do we wake up one morning and find out that we haven't been paying attention to Jordan? So I'm thinking, Andrew, we should go do some reporting together.
No, and the Jordanian government has expended huge amounts of its budget in terms of sustaining, no, not for the security, but also for sustaining the refugees. I mean, Jordan has been overwhelmed with refugees, not just in the last 2 years, but since the Iraq War. And the government has actually done a very good job of ensuring that those refugees are fed, are clothed, have shelter, are treated with dignity. And I think that that's important. I think having had the experience of integrating Palestinian refugees for 40-odd years has also helped that there's an infrastructure built in.
But
now
Dubai...
we have a question, Charlie, from the audience. Since ISIS is so active on social media, and we've heard lots of stories about this, as we said, much of the video we see comes from them filming it, and they've made some truly incredible propaganda videos. Why does the NSA have so much trouble intercepting their traffic?
I don't think we missed ISIS. I think we missed the rot inside the Iraqi security forces. I think if you talk to people in the administration, I've had this conversation in the White House, they were getting plenty of warnings about ISIS growing. They could look at those videos that were being put out and see what they had. But what they didn't expect is that in Mosul, the Iraqi security forces would turn tail and run. We had no advisors on the ground watching the military. We had no reporting chain that could tell us that when they said there were 1,000 guys in the barracks, that there were only 200, and that was a fact. I mean, those kinds of percentages were the case. They were ghost soldiers. The generals were pocketing the money, claiming they had 1,000 soldiers on the payroll. That's what the administration missed. And
But they missed the peril, didn't they? I mean, they missed the idea that this force
this force
was
wasn't
coalescing.
great until they waltz into Mosul, push on an open door, and inherit
Yeah,
tons
that's
upon
true.
tons of American Humvees,
That's
up-armored trucks, artillery, weapons. You know,
And how
I
did
don't
it-
know.
my-
You know,
my
I can
question is-
lose my iPhone and shut it down. I don't know why we can't do that with weapons. I think it's the NRA.
That's a good question. And how is it, Marty, that they know how to use this stuff? Again, you go to their videos and they're doing donuts in Raqqa in Syria
I don't
in these
know.
tanks. How do you drive a tank like
They
that?
read the field manuals. I
Well,
mean,
some of-
you know,
Some of them
Well,
are the
that-
Ba'athists.
Is it on
Iraq.
YouTube
So-
videos? They
well,
learn to drive a tank?
But no, that's a really good question, and some of this is not to be forgotten, is that how many billions of dollars did the U.S. government, under Petraeus's leadership, put towards training the Iraqi army?
1 trillion, wasn't it?
So we shouldn't be under any illusion that it's not possible that some of the Sunni-trained Iraqi army have defected over to the ISIS side and know these weapons, had trained on them. They know how to drive an MRAP because they were taught to drive them by the U.S. But the question had a good piece embedded in it, which is the social media and the sophistication these guys have, which is extraordinary. And I just want to share one brief anecdote. I know you don't want me to go there, but I'm going to go really fast. Remember when I threw out Sykes-Picot? Some of you know what it is. Tell your neighbor what it is if they don't know. Sykes-Picot
Quietly,
is the lines of after World War I that made it. So when we were reporting on this 100th anniversary of World War I started June 28th, 2014 on the bridge in Sarajevo where Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated. So I'm just sitting there, photographer's working, I have a little bit of time, and I'm looking at my phone, following Twitter, and I come to the live tweets that are coming from ISIS as they go across the berm from Syria into Iraq, and the hashtag on Twitter is hashtag Sykes-Picot over. Now, they don't just understand their history, they're social networking their history in a way that is running circles around a lot of the State Department efforts to do any kind of counterbalancing or counter-messaging about a belief in democracy or a belief in the things that we hold to be dear and true.
But I
And
don't
just so
think
you
we
know,
should be
Marty,
too-
they're also tweeting with the hashtag rise of ISIS.
Yeah.
So
Well, they're watching. A number of them have directly messaged me and asked me questions about the film. There are about 60,000, by one estimate, Twitter accounts that are pro-ISIS that are out there. And you can get into conversations with them about this. But I don't think we should be so surprised about their sophistication with social media. I mean, we've all become much more sophisticated with social media. There's no reason to believe that they wouldn't be on the same learning curve and using these tools that are widely available.
Just be good if the State Department was as good as they were.
Well, they can't run a healthcare website, so
And I want, Aaron, it's true. They are definitely reading. They're reading what we say. They're reading what you say. At the same time, I want to quote something I read today. I thought was excellent. So speaking of Twitter, I follow Blogs of War, and he had a fantastic podcast saying that actually the social media campaign will be the end of ISIS, precisely for the reason that the question was asked, that there is a lot of information and intelligence and GIS information is being tracked, because although they're very media savvy, they're not, bouncing the signals off of different satellites, that there's information, locational information, and so that at the end of the day, the fact that they've got the discussion going is one thing, but at least as far as Blogs of War is concerned, he thinks that this will be the end of ISIS in part because of social media showing the horrific and graphic violence might attract one kind of recruit, but it turns off significantly more recruits than it will attract.
So their days maybe are numbered for exactly the
I'm
reason
going to
they're
make a
selling
prediction. I'm going to disagree with the panel and say I don't think that ISIS is going to be as strong as it's been. I think it's waning. I don't think it's on the rise. I think it might be on the decline.
I don't want to be on the other side of that prediction.
Oh, no,
I think as an
contrary is
idea,
good.
they have some currency. I think as an entity, I think they've got real problems going forward. And I think we are going to go, as Charlie mentioned, into a slow grind. They're going to melt back into cities. We have to decide whether we're going to bomb locations that are next to civilians and men, women, and children that are, non-combatants. So it's going to be difficult and take a long time. But I think that they're not going to waltz into Mosul or Fallujah. They're not going to have those kinds of successes in the coming months.
There's a huge challenge, I think, going forward, and that is they are becoming very sophisticated in getting the message out. And journalism, the kind of journalism that gets practiced here at WGBH by the World, by Frontline, by the GroundTruth Project, that journalism is under attack. That journalism is directly under attack, and we need it now more than ever. You have to be on the ground to see this, or how are we going to understand it? So we live in a very cynical time when it's very easy to bash the media. You can bash it on the left with MSNBC, you can bash it on the right with Fox News, and we can all come away with a sense that journalism is somehow diminished. But every day there are these amazingly courageous reporters, many of them local reporters who are Iraqi and who are Syrian and who are, frankly, pretty amazing, who help a lot of news organizations. They're sometimes called fixers, a word I hate. They're colleagues, and they're great. And so many of us who come from Western news organizations are finding it so expensive, so hard to have the right resources to be able to calibrate the risks to go do that work, even though we want to go there and do the work, and some people are there doing that work on the ground. Going forward, this is a moment in the wake of Jim Foley's death and Stephen Sotloff's death to really think about, I think, the kind of journalism we need. On-the-ground journalism is imperiled, and it really cannot be a situation where we don't have it, or we're going to be flying blind, and that's going to be even harder for us going forward to win this.
And Charlie, what happens the next time one of those videos surfaces, the next time we hear of a journalist kidnapped? And
it's sort of mathematically inevitable that we are going to have more of them. I'm really horrified and sad to report. But I think what we have to do is take it as a moment to be recommitted to what we believe in. And what we believe in as journalists is that we have to be there on the ground. That's why I went back to Iraq. I had planned that trip long before Foley was executed, murdered, beheaded. And believe me, it didn't go down too well with my family. My wife and I have 4 boys. We're not thrilled that I was going to Iraq. Nor was I, frankly. But the reason I went was because we have people there on the ground. Tracy Shelton, who I mentioned, extraordinary journalist. If nothing else, I wanted to go there to say, I'm going to be here with you in a place. If you're going to be there, I'm going to be there. And we sort of need a moment of courage. We need to calibrate risk. We need to be really careful about risk analysis. But we also can't let them win. And we have to find a way to keep telling the story.
And this brings up a good discussion, Marty, briefly maybe. If that video surfaces, if that video were you, do you want ransom paid?
No.
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 Knowing full well that...
No, look, when I go into these situations, look, I'm not trying to sound heroic or brave at all. I mean, it's simply a risk that comes with the work. I mean, a lot of people have jobs that entail a certain amount of risk, and I accept that that's a risk, and I believe that the payment of ransom only promotes, more hostage taking. So we live in a very difficult situation because a number of European countries readily pay ransom, and the United States sits somewhere on the fence or doesn't pay at all, depending on the person. But I don't expect to have a ransom paid.
I was just going to say, Marty, I thought that too. And it's a perfectly rational way of looking at it. The U.S. foreign policy and the British policy of not paying ransom is a good one. It's in our field guide at GroundTruth that, that is a policy. You don't pay. Then I got to know the Foley family, who are extraordinary and who have this amazing son, James, who's being held. And believe me, it's a lot harder when you're dealing with that equation on that level. And if it were my son, I would be thinking very hard about that equation. It gets a lot more blurry. And I think one of the things that's been the best way of describing this is that right now what we need to do is pull this debate into the light. This has been debated in the darkness. There's oil
The
industry,
ransom debate, you mean?
the KNR, kidnap and ransom debate, has been in the darkness because oil executives are kidnapped frequently and big oil companies pay. Executives pay. There's a lot of industry of this, as was said in the beginning by Ted. This is how ISIS also makes its money. It's not just the oil, it's also kidnapping. This debate over either we hold the line and no one pays, and then we tell our Western allies, you can't do this anymore, we got to put these guys out of business, or we rethink the whole thing. David Rode, New York Times correspondent now with Reuters, who was famously kidnapped by the Taliban and escaped after 7 months, he is working with a lot of us on these protocols for standards and safety. The Foley family has the Legacy Foundation, which is dedicated to this idea of let's have a real debate about this. It's one of the greatest, most difficult moral questions of our time. If it comes down to saving a human life, do you pay? Or do you hold true to the policy to not create the perverse incentive for someone like ISIS to make money on that? That is so above my ability to think that through morally. I come at it emotionally, and I can hear it rationally, but we have to change the parameters of the debate.
It is a very difficult debate, and it's one that we've talked at length recently about doing a program about, and I've been pushing hard to look at this.
Mia, I have a slightly, I'm going to change the subject for just a moment. There's a question I was dying to ask you. You wrote a book about women who join up with these organizations, and yet all the stories that we've heard are just awful of the way that women are treated. How does that jibe? We had the Yazidis who are being brutalized, Shias are being brutalized. Is it simply that they're not of us, so they're the enemy?
They're misquoting. They are actually looking at the Quran, and they are misquoting parts of the Quran. You mentioned the Anfal, so it's the Surat al-Anfal that talks about war booty. And they are definitely, they've got 3 categories of women. And unfortunately, the media has only focused on the Western women. But there are the women who have gone with the families, because a lot of these guys have gone not just by themselves, the Tunisians, the Egyptians, the Saudis. They've gone with their daughters, their wives, their sisters as family units. So there's a lot of local Sunni women. Then there are the Syrian women who are, although not really fighting in ISIS, have really been part of Jabhat al-Nusra and have had more and large roles that are also opposing Bashar al-Assad. And then we've got the foreign women. So the Yazidi women and the Shia women that are being sold for $12 or gang raped, or there's even, I read a story today about a selection where the women, where they go into a village, let's say a Yazidi village, and the older women are selected out to be sold as slaves, and the younger women are sold, you know, for marriage purposes. It's really horrific. But that's not going to be the experience of the girls who tried to leave Denver, or of the women from Britain in the Midlands, and there's 100 French women there, including 2 young Jewish girls, which I just thought, those are some really confused girls. So there's actually hundreds of these foreign women, but there's hundreds more of the local women. And the women are being treated very diversely. I'll tell you, someone asked me today from the Washington Post, they said, well, you know, is there a higher bride price, or is there like a higher value of these foreign women? And unfortunately, it sounds awful, but yes, the blonder, the better. And so there's a fantastic story Paul Cruikshank relates in the book by Morton Storm, about Morton Storm, where Anwar al-Awlaki at some point said, my friend, find me a blonde convert. And that's eventually how they were able to find Anwar al-Awlaki and how the United States was able to kill him. So, I mean, that is literally their Achilles heel. That's one of the reasons why they're looking for these women. And that's why I see it as a kind of, you know, that they're predators, that this is a kind of child abuse. So, and I'm hoping that we treat them as victims and not as, you know, suspects. And that's one of the reasons the families were hesitant to come forward. Now we're more and more seeing families come forward when their kids go missing.
Well, that's the subject, I think, for another discussion. What happens when these people come back? And there is a big debate over whether they become criminals or we somehow try and rehabilitate them. We just have one more question, and this is also from the audience, and this has been asked a lot, and I don't know that we've gotten a great answer, and I think each of you should take a short crack at it. What is your best guess as to ISIS's capacity to bring the fight here to the U.S. They've certainly threatened us, and those threats have been used by American policymakers, generally right-wing folks, to justify taking the fight there.
You know, none of us here that I know are privy to the sort of intelligence reports that come across the president's desk every day, so it's hard to assess what the sort of state of threat is. And even if we were privy to those reports, we wouldn't necessarily really know. Though, you know, we spend a lot of time, the three of us, in this territory thinking about it. I, for one, do not see them as an imminent threat at this point. That doesn't mean that there won't be copycat or people inspired by ISIS to take action, but the kind of idea that they can mount a 9/11 type attack at this point, degraded as they are, as hunkered down as they have to be with the bombs falling, I just don't think, I don't see them as being an imminent threat. You know, we have to endure a certain level of terrorism. We have, unfortunately, I mean, we have school shootings or people going with guns into offices and shooting people, even beheadings, and you know, we don't do much about those at all, but yet we seem to think that we need to go fight a foreign war as soon as there's some idea that some foreigners have attacked us from abroad. I think we have to, you know, step back and take stock of this.
I'm having a hard time stepping back from this one because Foley was a friend. And I am aware of the lack of ability to step back. But I also think there is a peril that I expressed earlier that is real, which is they're attacking us, as in we who are journalists. And I think that is something that we're going to see more of, because if they can put the lights out on how we view this situation and how we get inside and really find these stories and tell the truths like you did in your film, that's to their advantage. And I think one of the perils now is that they're attacking our ability to report on the ground. And I think that's real, and I think it's ominous, and we need to be super aware of it in our industry, and we need to deal with it. I think the other thing is I'm haunted because I covered the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. And I shared with you, I was a police reporter. So I went there as a police reporter. And I remember the New York City cops, the same guys who covered the drug wars I was telling you about, and they shrugged their shoulders, and they shrugged their shoulders again and said, hey, 6 people die in New York every day. That's how many died in the first World Trade Center bombing. And no one took it seriously except John O'Neill, the FBI director in New York, who was a source and a guy I knew. And he kept telling us about this peril. And John O'Neill left the FBI to become security for the World Trade Center, and he was on the top floor on the morning of 9/11. And I feel a sense of being haunted by missing it. So I'm actually, my radar is so high right now of peril to the country, but even more precisely and more direct to my heart is peril to what we do as journalists.
So I would have to agree with you, Martin, that when we look at people like Rouleau or Bibeau, the two gentlemen in Canada who perpetrated terrorist attacks a few weeks ago, back to back, within the same 3-day period, we are never going to be able to get to the point where we can eliminate any kind of copycat or self-starter or lone actor terrorist. I think the fact is that, and you actually stole my thunder where I said the same thing, we can't stop school shootings. We can't stop random acts of violence. What I would like the media to do in terms of refocusing, and this wouldn't be directed at WGBH, but just because an act of violence is perpetrated by someone who happens to be Muslim doesn't automatically make it terrorism. By the same token, I was looking at, you know, the shootings this last weekend, and I thought, well, why aren't they using, you know, the gentleman caught in Pennsylvania? Like, well, you know, he killed 6 people and he was paramilitary. Why aren't we calling him a terrorist? And it's one of the things that sort of irks me, that we have a very different response of violence that is perpetrated, for example, in Oklahoma, that might just be regular, routine workplace violence, but the person converted to Islam, gotta be terrorism. And I think that the moment that we can have a little more sensitivity in how we deal with the violence, we can then distinguish what is really a threat to our national security and what is going to be the kind of violence that is perpetrated in the United States, unfortunately, every day.
Every time I do one of these, they always end on a cheery note, just like that.
I'm a killer at parties.
Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you for the great questions. It was a pleasure to be here with Marty, Charlie, and Mia, and I hope you got something out of it. I certainly did. We'll be out in the foyer. There's some drinks and some food, and thank you all very much. And remember to tweet with Rise of ISIS.
A couple of things before we get going. We want to thank everybody on the panel. Now, Aaron, before you go, you started this by, asking the question, will you be more scared by the end of this or not? Right? So I need to throw, and obviously the issue is not black and white, right? But a question for you, since you posed it to both Marty and to Charlie. If you were held hostage, because it's 1-1, a tie, if you were held.
Oh, geez, look at the time.
And you have a family, all seriousness, you have a family, just like Charlie. Would you want the government to pay the ransom to free you? Because Aaron has covered events in the Middle East for many years, so it's not like you're a stranger to that region.
I was in Lebanon, and I had someone jokingly suggest to me that he should take me and sell me to Hezbollah. And he promised that we would split the ransom, and I thought, wouldn't that be funny? Ha ha, very good idea. And then I realized, wait a minute, who's going to pay that money?
Are you ducking this question?
I'm ducking this question. I would
honestly
have to say the answer is Charlie. In principle, I think it's a horrible thing. I think by paying ransom, you are letting these groups know that it's a good way to make money. In principle, I would think when I was standing there and when I was on that video, I would hope that someone would pay.
All right. Well, thank you.
Does that make me a hypocrite?
No. But again, it's not black and white. You know, there's a quote that I use over and over that mainstream media lives in periods and exclamation points, and public media should own question marks, right? And the supporters here, the folks here, I mean, you come out on a school night to talk about something dreadful like this, or to listen and to participate, and to have our panel, you know, if you know David Fanning at Frontline, and if he asks Martin Smith, what are we going to do about ISIS, you better believe that it's not over, Frontline's coverage. And Andrew Sussman and the team, and Marco Werman, this isn't over. With Aaron as part of the team, and social media and other reporters and other producers here. Mia mentioned she's got a book or research coming up, I think, the child predator lore, that she's doing some research of the ISIS recruit. So you know it's not over with her either. And Charlie Sennott, if you don't know, he's with the GroundTruth Project. Did you hear that at all tonight? And you'll be able to meet him. And it's not over there. It is a passion, it is a living passion for all of these folks to get this message out. So just to stay tuned with this. The cool thing about this was the interaction. And if you weren't on Twitter, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of people in Boston and around the country that were participating in this. Some were asking questions, some leaving comments, and others were just voyeurs and reading it. And we know that. And it's really interesting that in the social media frenzy, even I think as Marty said, that ISIS, they are very in on Twitter. That what did he say? That there's 60,000 and he actually tweets some of them or communicates. So it is so cool that there's interaction from this group and from outside of here. And just one shameless plug, WGBH Radio is a place that you can interact, especially with Jim and Marjorie from 11 to 2 every day. And when they cover ISIS, you're now more informed than most of the audience. So please give a call to that show and engage that way. All right, this whole thing, as if you don't want to hear it again, because we know you want to hear this again, it will be on a website beginning tomorrow, pri.org, and you can go to that. But even if you don't want to hear it and watch it, email it to a friend or people in your community that you think would benefit by this, because this was outstanding. You don't get this anywhere. It's really tremendous. So we're very lucky, and again, for the supporters of WGBH, that donate every year. We thank you for that, because you made this possible. On a bright note, what a transition. There's going to be more conversation outside. Don't be shy. Get right up in the face of these 4 folks, because they want to answer your questions one-on-one, and you never get a chance to do that. But when you leave, fill out a survey, and you can win a pair of tickets to the WGBH Cider House Brews event taking place here Thursday, November 13th, in about a week. So that's it for the program. Thank you. It ran long, but it was so engaging that we just thought, let's stretch it. Thank you. And have a good night.